unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamlin, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, and we are internationally syndicated, starting with late night in the Midlands and the terrestrial affiliates here in the U.S., as well as Black Swamp Digital Radio, also in the United States, and in the U.K. We do have deprogrammed talk radio, as well as their terrestrial affiliates in London and Leeds. We bring you another powerhouse show today, 2 hours, 2 different guests, and both which you'll truly enjoy. Very, very informative, and both these gentlemen have a lot under their belt. And I can tell you right now, folks, this 1 hour for each of them is not going to be enough, especially for the guest I'm about to introduce now. There is so much to his resume. I would hope you folks have a chance to have read it on his bio on our website before this actually airs. If not, well, you're going to hear it directly from the man himself. As a retired DEA supervisory agent, as well as an expert witness and trial consultant, he has done so much work. I'm going to let the work speak for himself. So let's bring on Mr. Mike Levine. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Dr. J.
Let's go back to, I believe, was it 71 or 73 when you first started working for the DEA? Was it that? Is that the year? Am I correct on that?
Well, DEA was created in 1973.
Yes, because of Nixon.
The creation of DEA was to end a war that nobody knew about, and that is the war between agencies vying for power in the war on drugs. And the big war was between U.S. Customs, the Hard Narcotics Smuggling Unit, which I was part of, and the then Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. So to end that war, which one day, if I live long enough, I'll write a book about the war that no one knew about, President Nixon created the Drug Enforcement Administration. And I was one of the beginners or the founders or the very beginning cadre that manned the DEA. I was there at the birth of DEA. How we DEA people who came on at that time, we referred to our years of service as DEA plus prior relative service. It's all counted as one continuous line of service. So in all, I have 25 years, not counting military. I had 4 years military, so I had 25 years as a federal agent, the major part of it undercover and deep cover, which, by the way, is the title of the book I'm going to be talking about. And I also served as the head of a drug bureau in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So in all, I've got 30-some-odd years on the front lines of federal service and state service. And that continues to this day because as a trial consultant and an expert witness, one of the areas of my expertise is use of force. That is, when police kill in the line of duty, I'm among the people who examine it and determine whether it is justified. Did you have the appropriate reason to take this man's life or this woman's life? And I do that right now for 2 district attorneys' offices, plus as a trial consultant. So I'm actually, in some ways, very much still involved in law enforcement. I've had a lot of cases where I've been retained as an expert witness and a trial consultant, where I would end up recommending that a federal investigation be begun, initiated into the people who did the murder, or the people who ended up incarcerating people with no just cause. And a lot of times this involves really corrupt agents and police, and they deserve to be watched. And I'm one of the people that does that. It's hard to separate that from my career as a law enforcement officer because it seems to be one continuous 5-decade line. I began my career basically, as I started out, my first job in law enforcement was with what they call the Treasury Intelligence Division, which was the enforcement arm of the Internal Revenue Service the first year. And because I'm bilingual, I speak Spanish and English and a little bit of Italian, they immediately used me as an undercover. That is, I worked undercover cases with organized crime, gambling and loan sharking and that kind of thing. But what happened is that if you put me on the street, I grew up in the South Bronx, more people were offering me drugs than gambling or any other opportunity. So I started buying drugs or working as an undercover agent in narcotic enforcement. And I proved very effective in that. But at the time, there were only 250 federal narcotic agents in the world. I couldn't get that job, so I transferred into the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms. And there continued an undercover career, combining working undercover, buying illegal guns, and at the same time drugs, because a new law was instituted saying that you could not carry a firearm and commit any federal crime, particularly drugs, while carrying a firearm. So I would combine the two. I would go out on the street, undercover, meet people, most of it in New York at that time, and sell myself as a bad guy, which I became quite good at, and end up making deals with street criminals for both guns and drugs, and I was making case after case after case, and as a result of that, was hired by the Hard Narcotics Smuggling Unit of U.S. Customs, who was at the very cutting edge of the war on drugs. And therein began a career that was more than a career. It began a life. I began working undercover overseas. I was actually living with drug dealers in Bangkok, Thailand, and in Cambodia on a case. Some of this was captured in a book written by Donald Goddard called Undercover, but I don't recommend the book. I hate the book, actually. But he captured some parts of it. He was afraid to go against the Central Intelligence Agency because over in Southeast Asia was my first run-in with Central Intelligence protecting drug traffickers. Goddard in Undercover kind of milk-toasted it. He didn't want to go again. He was more interested in getting some kind of a television contract, movie contract, which put him at war with me. When DEA was created to end the war between customs, because we were really at war. We were arresting each other's informants. We were coming to blows. We were getting in situations that almost ended in shootouts between customs agents and federal narcotic agents. So the war nobody knew about resulted in July of 1973, the creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And I traded my U.S. Treasury Department badge for one of the Justice Department and was one of the beginning, or the founders at the very beginning of the Drug Enforcement Administration. In the Drug Enforcement Administration, most of my 17 years was spent as a supervisory agent, but also as a deep cover agent. That is, I was one of the few men and women that went into other countries with fake passports and actually lived drug traffickers. This, of course, became very, very hazardous, risky. People were getting killed. I think what turned the corner was the torture murder of Enrique Kiki Camarena. And once that happened, the whole undercover scenario began shifting to people that our government, that our Justice Department never trusted to even testify in court, criminal informants. Criminal informants began being used instead of undercover agents, and that was very much to the detriment of our entire justice system, and continues to this day. And it's a total destructo of the U.S. justice system, and it's part of my work now as a trial consultant and an expert witness. I'm one of the areas of my expertise is the undercover handling of informants in any situation. And what happens, I don't know if I'm going too fast and too far, because an hour, you're right, an hour just isn't going to do it. But when you start using criminal informants undercover, you have to stress the word criminal. these are people who become informants because they are arrested and they're given a chance to get their charges disappeared, quote unquote disappeared, and / or work for money. Now we're talking about millions of dollars. The idea is, are you going to depend on these crooks and criminals, and I mean some of them have horrific records, to be telling you the truth in court? Are you going to depend on them not to set up people? Are you going to depend on them not to flake people, that is, put evidence on them? Are you going to depend on them not to use their position as U.S. government informants to violate the law with impunity? And all of that depends on agents who handle them. The agents who handle them have a great desire to make their informants become successful. Let them make cases. Look the other way at whatever they do, because the agents who handle these informants are rewarded richly. They're rewarded with promotions and awards and attaboys. And so it's the corrupt left hand is washing the corrupt right hand. The only thing to stop that are mandates and regulations and standards like the Attorney General's guidelines on informant handling. And those are set forth to protect the American people from criminal informants doing what they will to turn you or anybody listening into the kind of fodder that becomes a statistic and money. And so one of my areas of expertise is the training of agents and police, and I've been doing that beginning with my career in the Drug Enforcement Administration right up to this day. In fact, when I was with the Department of Justice, I wrote a manual that is still being used. It's called Undercover Tactics and Informant Handling. It can be viewed at academia.edu, where it's right now one of the top 0.03% downloads by researchers and police agencies globally. So if any of your listeners are interested in that, I urge them to take a look at it to understand what's happening to them, what's going on around them, what may affect them or their family at any moment. From, I guess, the highlight or low light of my government career or my career as an undercover DEA agent happened when I was working undercover in South America in a case called Operation Trifecta that went trifecta because our undercover team penetrated the very top of the drug world in Mexico. That is the Mexican government. Penetrated the whole banking scenario in Panama, at that time headed by Manuel Noriega. Went into Bolivia. This is a team of deep cover agents, and made the biggest drug deal, I believe, biggest undercover drug deal in history, and I think it's a record that's never going to be beaten, not by a government agent. We negotiated for 15 tons of cocaine.
Wow.
And the 15 tons of cocaine was to come in with the help of the Mexican military. And this became the book Deep Cover. Deep Cover was a New York Times bestseller. If anyone is interested in the reality of what happened to Kiki Camarena, in the reality of how people in his very own agency, the Drug Enforcement Administration, betrayed him, how Central Intelligence betrayed him, how the State Department betrayed him, you've got to read Deep Cover. You can get it for a buck or two on the digital version. But if you're interested in the history of that, I could not urge you more. If not, don't bother. I feel I have come away very disheartened because at the time of this undercover operation, where, as I said, I was working deep cover, living with drug traffickers throughout South America, into Mexico, into Panama, and became so paranoid at how my bosses, how the CIA, how the State Department were handling this case, that I started to suspect they're intentionally destroying it. And I began wiring myself and taping every conversation. And that's what makes up this book. It was so startling to me and the people who are really interested, like Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers could not believe how mainstream media would not cover this book. they avoided covering this book, and he put me on Project Censored as the most censored drug book, or book on the drug war up to that time in history. And that was part of Project Censored, and you can find that on YouTube, the Bill Moyers interview, and we go into detail about the censorship of this book. But it's still there for people who are really interested. For people who are really interested in the true facts behind narco. But it's there, I lived it. Again, I said I was so startled by what was happening around me, what I was witnessing, what I was hearing, that I had to wire myself. I was completely paranoid, and it should be apparent in the book. The other thing that I think you wanted to talk about was Griselda Blanco and Papo Mejia and the cocaine cowboy wars, and all of that, again, is in another book that's digital. You can get it for $1 or $2. It's called The Big White Lie. It's still a major bestseller nationally. You've got to, if you're interested in the truth, what really happened to you? I'm talking about you, every American out there paying taxes. You pay well over trillions of dollars between state and federal taxes dedicated toward winning a quote-unquote war on drugs that doesn't exist, that you should be interested. If not, I don't know. I really don't have much confidence in people anymore. I don't know, all my expectations, Dr. J, when I wrote this book, my expectations were that it would cause a governmental riot, that it would get Congress up, that Congress would call me up to. But no, it was, as Bill Moyers said, in essence, it was all censored. And at that, I'm going to open it up to you. Ask me. As you can see, I'm kind of all over the place, and I apologize for that.
No, please don't, because everything you're saying is extremely, extremely relevant. First of all, like you said, this book that should not be as censored. It should have caused a government revolt. And my guess is the CIA probably played a big hand in trying to censor it because, of course, they're never going to admit to protecting high-level drug traffickers. You also confirmed something for me, which is that the Mexican government is, in fact, probably one of the largest cartels, or is a cartel in themselves, because there was a recent documentary made called Cartel Land. And at the very end, when the opening shot is of people cooking methamphetamine in Mexico. At the very end, they go back to that shot, and this time it scrolls down to the person who's being interviewed, and he's wearing a Mexican Federale police shirt. And he basically says that the corruption goes all the way to the top, and Mexico is involved. And also, Mike, I'm sure you know this, but the super meth that's coming from Mexico is coming from these giant factories. Now, if it's illegal, how can they get away with using giant factories, giant tanker trucks leaving with the liquid meth or the products they need to create it? This is on an industrial scale. And if they're doing it so openly, they have to be doing it with some sort of kickback going to the government or at the direct orders of the government.
But, Dr. J, as you're speaking, I'm just thinking, my God, you've got to read Deep Cover, because it tells you the nuts and bolts of how all of that works in the Mexican government. I was undercover. I was posing as Luis Miguel Garcia, and as a half Sicilian, half Puerto Rican mafia don. And again, we were negotiating for 15 tons of cocaine to come in with the help of the Mexican military into the U.S. They were going to help us bring it into the U.S. And I was promised through the bodyguard of the incoming president of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, I was promised that when this deal goes through, the president was promising me a wide open door through Mexico into the U.S. for smuggling any quantity of drugs I wanted.
Wow.
That was recorded. It was on videotape. It makes it inconceivable that our government would move to stop this case before we exposed Mexico. Well, at the same time, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, was on the table. Congress, there was great controversy. A lot of people did not want it, and the news that the incoming president of Mexico had made an overture toward the mafia to open up Mexico for wide open for drug smuggling, protected drug smuggling into the U.S., would have killed NAFTA. Ergo, our case, Operation Trifecta, for other reasons as well, had to be killed. How incredible does that sound to you? Where are the interests of the American people to do something like that? The then head of U.S. Customs was aware of all of this, and he made a public statement, Dwight Von Raab. He said that our government is more interested in international trade agreements than the torture murder of a DEA agent. And he resigned, out of disgust. But yet nobody in media picked it up. Nobody wanted to run with it. Bill Moyers was astounded, as I said, and he named this book the most censored by media book on drugs, period. Yeah. What else can I, as one human being that actually lived it, recorded it as it happened, what else could I do but feel the kind of frustration that has me on the air with you? You know, I'm always looking for a chance to spark that fire, to help America take their own government into their hands and make them accountable. And accountable for what? We've paid trillions, not counting in lives, yet we accept this BS that's called the war on drugs that we keep paying for, even though it's not real. And it gets less real all the time. For instance, if you look at Afghanistan, they are the big supplier of heroin throughout the world. You think we couldn't stop the growth of the poppy? Yes, we could.
Well, actually, Mike, it got a little worse. The Taliban almost eradicated all of the poppy. We get in there, and then all of a sudden they become the world's largest supplier.
Yeah, I wonder why. It's the same thing Central Intelligence did in Vietnam when I was working undercover in Cambodia and Thailand. They came in and stopped me. Why did they stop me? They stopped me because the drug traffickers loved me. I mean, when I say loved me, they bought my act. They believed me. They thought I was the capo de tutti frutti of the mafia in the U.S., and I was going to offer them huge business into the U.S., direct into the U.S. So they invite me to the factory. The factory was where they were producing hundreds of kilos of heroin a day, probably the biggest in the world. It was in Chiang Mai at that time. That's when Central Intelligence came in and stopped me. You're not going there. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, I'm called into the American Embassy in Bangkok, and I have this conference with my very first face-to-face CIA agent. And the guy was very impressive. You know, he was dressed up like some sort of a movie figure, even though I later came to find out that Central Intelligence doesn't do anything that you see in Tom Clancy books or movies. Their informants do it. They call them the informants agents. DEA calls them criminal informants. CIA calls them agents. And anyway, this CIA officer, not an agent, this officer tells me, you're not going up there, Mike. And I said, why? No, we can't cover you there. I said, I didn't know you were covering me here. He said, well, we can't cover you there. You'll be killed, or it's too dangerous. We don't want you killed. And I said, I joined this thing. I had a brother who was a heroin addict, and I really, at the time, I believed that I was on some kind of mission from God. I really believed in all the lines that I was being fed, that you're at war with the worst enemy America ever had. The war on drugs is a holy war, et cetera, et cetera. I said, what about my choice? I mean, I didn't join this. I didn't raise my right hand. I didn't start carrying a gun. I didn't start working undercover because I was going to take no chances. I want to go. I think I can handle it. And he looked at me and said, Mike, we checked your military. We checked your records. You understand that you don't know the whole picture. You don't know the big picture. And I was a good soldier. I understood that. And what he was telling me was something that I had to listen to. I didn't know the big picture. At that moment, I didn't know how corrupt the big picture was. I thought it's real, that I'm working for the same goal that the CIA is working for. that all our intelligence agency, I thought, were working for. And that is a better USA. That is a healthier American people. That is our kids protected from the flow of white powder into their veins and brains and all of that BS. I thought that's what all our goals were. But I was wrong. And I agreed to do what they asked me to do, and that is to end my case. Don't go to Chiang Mai. To end my case in Bangkok with the arrest of the people who I was dealing with in Bangkok. And, of course, I agreed. Who was I? I was just one agent, low-ranked agent, but just happened to be good at undercover work. And the arrest was made. It was written up within the Treasury Department at that time. It was the first case where an undercover agent arrested the courier in New York and the financier in Florida, and then went and got the source in Thailand, including the guy who was making false bottom suitcases. They just included me in everything. They loved me. I mean, you know, when I teach undercover tactics, one of the mandates of an undercover agent is if they like me. If they don't like me, they won't trust me. If they like me, I own them. And so I was very good at that. But I accepted it. I later go back to my unit in New York. I was working for a most wonderful agent in charge you could imagine, an ex-New York City detective named Al Seeley. And Seeley then puts me as part of all the investigations that are coming out of Southeast Asia because I was there. And he figured I would be a good asset in doing that. And the first thing that I get involved in is the smuggling of heroin in the dead bodies of our GIs, our killed in action people. And myself and a detective, ex-detective Louis Culver, who was a special agent with my same unit, we interrogate a guy who was an informant in the body bag case. And he starts naming the people involved and naming the route and how the drugs were being put in caskets and the bodies, etc. And what I realize is he's naming the very people I had, the same people who were protected in Chiang Mai were the same source of the heroin going into the dead bodies of our GIs. So it was inconceivable of me until that moment that Central Intelligence would protect these people. Do you understand how nauseating that was for someone like me with a brother who was a heroin addict, who would later die because of his heroin addiction? I was totally destroyed.
I would imagine, and it was probably very eye-opening at the same time when you realized that it's all a sham.
Oh my God, yeah, and yes, but I have to spend the next couple of hours talking to you about what my life was like at that time, being a young agent with no power whatsoever, no protection, out there. When I say out there, I was on the other side of the world alone, with no protection, nobody to turn to.
How many times would you say the CIA in your lifetime prevented you from doing your job and protected these drug dealers?
Well, three huge times. One was Bangkok the first time, but the much bigger case was in the book Deep Cover and in the book The Big White Lie. They protected the entire General Motors of cocaine in South America. They protected the people who were spreading cocaine throughout the world. 99% of it was these people who were protected. The CIA did admit it, by the way, during Congress, and again, media never picked it up. They said, regrettably, I think Frederick Hitz, I have the video of it, and the only way you could see it is if you were tape recording on C-SPAN. Said that regrettably we used as assets some of the drug dealers in Bolivia at that time. And at the time, these were the drug dealers I wrote about in both Deep Cover and The Big White Lie. And I said, he corroborated what I said in both books. The Inspector General of Central Intelligence actually corroborated it.
That's actually really sad. You have one hand of the government is telling people, hey, look, drugs are bad. We're doing everything to eradicate them. And then on the other hand, you have the CIA protecting them, and also they were involved in actually making sure some of these drugs come so they can have the money to fund things, for instance, like the Contras, right? Isn't that how Freeway Ricky Ross ended up getting involved and supplied cocaine in South Central Los Angeles? Wasn't it to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua?
That was such a small part of the freeway. Yes, that was the main motivation of all their help. At one point in deep cover, I was dealing with a Mexican colonel who was the grandson of an ex-Mexican president who had written the Mexican Constitution, and we had maps laid out on a table. This was being videotaped, and he pointed to one map in the area of Mexico, Puebla, Mexico, and said, this is where we're training Contras. Of course, that disappeared. That was sent to Edwin Meese, the Attorney General of the United States, and then the Attorney General of the United States got on the phone with the Attorney General of Mexico and warned him, blew our cover. Now, that is in my book. That's the most libelous thing in the world. That is in. What I'm saying is in a New York Times bestseller. And what happened? How did our government react? Nothing. Absolute zero.
So they were letting if you had gotten killed, they would have just brushed it under the rug, because by exposing the fact that you're an undercover agent, essentially you're put in the crosshairs.
Oh, we were. I don't know, some CIA agent, they wrote books and movies about her being exposed by media. I mean, it seems to me that I didn't know any CIA officer who really did undercover work. Not one. Not a single one. Again, they used for undercover work their assets, who they call agents. But the people who in those years used to do all the undercover work, it was like playing Russian roulette, were DEA agents. These guys, we used to be called undercovers, because for all the way up until the mid-'80s, the prosecutors never wanted to put an informant before a jury. So there was an expression, they used Duke in. If you get an informant, he can make a case against, you name it, I don't care where. Actually, the biggest cases in our history were made by informants who introduced me in as a relative, as a friend. They gave me their credibility, and I ran with it. I got the informant out, and that's what DEA did. And the expression was Duke in. And there was a cadre of undercover agents. That's all we did. We were called undercovers. Informants would come in, and they say, I need a Spanish-speaking undercover. I need a Spanish-speaking undercover who knows the cocaine business. That was me. I knew the business. I knew how to make cocaine from growing the leaf right up to cocaine hydrochloride. Why is that important? Because when you sit down with the top drug dealers in the world, if you don't know what you're talking about, you're dead. So I knew the business, so I would be called upon to do this over and over, like a role that you play. The only thing is the acting role that you're playing is you're acting with your audience, a deadly audience, 2 inches from your face.
And South American drug dealers, cartels, are extremely violent, known for their torturing tactics, known for literally having, no value on life. And like you said, if you didn't know what you're talking about, you wouldn't even seen the bullet coming behind your head.
Yeah, well, this relatively small group of DEA agents, it makes me laugh. I was in college. I got out of the military, went back to college, and I was studying accounting, and the only thing I learned was that I hated accounting. There's no way I could live my life as an accountant. And I listened to a late-night talk show, and during the talk show, this journalist was talking about James Bond, the movie James Bond. And this journalist had worked throughout government agencies, and he said there's only one government agency that really lives that life. He said that's these federal narcotic agents who travel the world, work undercover. CIA doesn't know, at that time, no other agency did it, and that appealed to me. I have to go back even further. 18 years old, I'm in the military. I'm a military policeman. I get into a fight over a $3 hat, and a fellow military policeman whose name is Haywood pulls his gun and pulls the trigger, aiming it at a 45 caliber, aiming it at my stomach,
Jeez.
and the gun misfires.
Thank gosh.
That I owe Haywood a great gratitude for that incident, which freed me, which made me understand that any moment is the right moment to die, and I wasn't going to waste a second of my life. I was hungry for experience. I was hungry to travel the world, to try everything, to live out a fantasy. And what better fantasy than to live the life closest you can to a James Bond? I was a kid. And that's really what got me into what I do. Of course, reality took over, but that was the very beginning of it.
Now, I'm going to try to cram what I could in 15 minutes. And like I said, 1 hour was not enough. We definitely have to have you back on. There was something you told me before we started recording this interview that I think people need to hear, because I've always been wondering who killed Griselda Blanco. I knew once she'd be deported, her life was going to end. Her 3 children were killed. Over 250 people were attributed to her, either by her orders of killing people or by her actual hand. Now, you made a very startling revelation that I don't think through all my research, paying attention, I've never found that answer, and you were able to tell me.
Oh, yeah. I congratulate you that you, among very, very few people, are aware of the most important parts of the story. You were aware of the Cocaine Cowboys War. At that time, I was part of the Vice President's task force, the South Florida task force, so I was there during these Cocaine Cowboy Wars. But at the same time, they were using me undercover in an operation called Operation Hun, where I was working alongside this incredibly beautiful woman who used to sell cocaine for the Bolivian government, Sonia Atala. That's all in the Big White Lie. The target of that investigation, among others, we actually targeted the minister of cocaine, they called him, in Bolivia, the head of the government, and we targeted Papo Mejia, Octavio Mejia. You might as well call him Dr. Death. He was probably one of the most prolific killers in the whole southern cone and all South America. What am I talking about? He was a murderous SOB, and that gave me great pleasure in targeting him. And as an undercover agent, posing as Miguel Luis Garcia, I was able to do a deal with Papo Mejia. The whole deal is in the Big White Lie. Papo Mejia escaped arrest, and what I knew about him was he was the #1 enemy of Griselda Blanco. They were both at war with each other. A lot of the details are in the Big White Lie, but suffice it to say right now, they hated each other. They were constantly sending people to kill each other. It was an emissary of Griselda Blanco that ended up stabbing Papo Mejia with a bayonet in Miami airport. I think he stabbed him 10 times, but Papo Mejia, being the gutter rat that he is, he survived it, and we got him, and he stood trial. He then did 28 years. But the enmity between him and Griselda Blanco, for us who were working the investigations, was a thing of legend. More people died between the two of them killing each other. That was the Cocaine Cowboy Wars. So now, Papo Mejia does 28 years in prison. The amazing thing is, I get a call from a lawyer. Now I'm working as a trial consultant. I get a call from Papo Mejia's lawyer that he wants to talk to me. And I meet him. I happen to be in Miami, so we sit down and talk. I'm retired. I'm now a trial consultant. And we have lunch, and my wife is there. And my wife, to this day, can't believe this. And this attorney says, would I be an expert for Papo Mejia to help get him out? I said, the man wants to kill me. And he says, you're no longer #1 on his list.
Oh, yeah, like that's going to be really reassuring.
You could write your own check. He says, you're no longer #1 on his list. There are other people. Well, the other people I know is Griselda Blanco. He wanted to kill Griselda Blanco more than anything. Anyway, I refused to have anything to do with the case. I had a good lunch. It was, for me, a lot of laughs at the time. I couldn't believe. If you deal with enough attorneys, you can believe anything. Now all these years go by. Papa Mejia is deported. He does his time, but is deported. Griselda Blanco is deported. 1 month after Papa Mejia is deported, Griselda Blanco was killed. My sources say, who do you think did it?
Mejia.
Who do you think did it, Mike? And that's where we're at right now, Dr. J.
There's something that is happening right now, and that is the trial of El Chapo Guzman, Joaquin Guzman, also known as the head of the Sinaloa cartel, either the largest or one of the largest drug cartels in Mexico. He escaped Mexican prison twice, and now he's standing trial in New York, a federal court, of course. What do you think is going to be the outcome? Of course, there's enough evidence to convict the guy, but I could already notice that some of the jurors who had to be dismissed for anxiety, since the cartels are ruthless and will kill essentially anybody, I fear that there might be some jury tampering.
Well, they'll do anything they can, but why I almost have to laugh. In the 1980s, the mayor of Medellin, Colombia, made this statement, and again, mainstream media barely picked it up. And he said that, if you Americans, if you took every cartel leader, every single one, you put them against the wall, and you gunned them down today, he says there's a line of 100 or more behind each one ready to take his place.
Yes.
That's how futile the situation is. Chapo is just the bum of the month, as they say. He's the flag that mainstream media waves to convince you that there really is a drug war. Now, I wrote an essay that was published in a book that was much lauded, a critique of the media, written by Christina Borgeson, called Feet to the Fire. The essay, which you can get on the internet, you can also get it via academia.edu, is Mainstream Media, the Drug War Shills. And what you're seeing with Chapo is a prime example of mainstream media sending up a flag, getting huge, huge coverage, a lot of public interest, selling a lot of products and airtime. And what's the end result of it? You're convincing America that this drug war, that spending the millions that we are and putting Chapo away is worth it, when it's not. When what the mayor of Medellin, Colombia said all those years ago is the truth. Going after these super killers, is a waste. That's why in my career, what I recognized this, that this is a sham. It's a shill game. It's like three-card Monte. Again, I urge you, it's called Mainstream Media, the Drug War Shills. You can get it on academia.edu. But if you're interested, I urge you to read it. And you'll see that the reason we've spent trillions on this war on drugs is mainstream media refusing to cover it the way it should be covered, as a search for truth, not a search for media, not a search for ratings, not a search to sell products. That's really what mainstream media is good at, not the watchdog that we Americans need. People who watchdog over government. Mainstream media has long ago given us that role. One of our, was it President, I think it was Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson once said that you can't even have a democracy unless you have a free, aggressive media as a watchdog.
Yeah, we don't have that anymore.
We don't have that, and we don't have America anymore. The government is out of our control, out of our hands. Sadly.
You're absolutely right, and I always, when it comes talking to about the Second Amendment, I know this doesn't have anything to do with us, but I'm going to bring this up for a reason, is the reason why the Second Amendment exists is because if the government gets too out of control, we the people have a right to overtake it and essentially take the people running the government out and start a new society essentially. But by them trying to abolish, especially here in California and throughout the United States, trying to abolish guns in general, that doesn't mean the criminals on the streets are not going to have them. It doesn't mean they're not going to be flowing in and out. You can't walk into a store, a gun store, and buy an AK-47 fully automatic, yet every single gang, at least gang, maybe not gang member, has access to them. And so
No,
clearly they're still going to exist. If you take the guns away from the innocent people, the law-abiding citizens, that doesn't mean that the criminals are not going to have them.
you're preaching to the choir, Dr. J.
It's just sad that a lot of people don't recognize this. I was talking to somebody off air, and he said, "I don't understand why we need guns anymore. Police have them." And he said it's not 1776 anymore. I said that's not the point. I said the point is we have the right, if the government gets too out of control, for us to take it over. And he just could not see it. He was just so blinded by the Democratic Socialists of America and this and that. And it was just like a futile dream that didn't exist. And it goes back to something you said. We, not only is the war on drugs fake, Mike, America is no longer America. We are not free. We have the illusion of being free.
That's why I urge people again. I don't make any money out of it. I just urge you to read the war on drugs. Mainstream media, the shills for the war on drugs. You have to read it because it's the whole principle that you and I are talking about now. How mainstream media sells images that are completely false and fraudulent, and they do great damage to us. And what else can I say? What else can I say but write what I lived? My experiences out in the form of essays and books, and I'm pretty worn out, to tell you the truth. But I guess you give me an open mic, I'll still talk.
Yeah, and this is why it's important. After I was reading your biography, and you've just done so much, that's why I know for sure we're going to definitely have to do this again and for longer. I'm just going to get to a couple more questions, and we'll wrap this time. First of all, what would you say is the biggest threat for drugs right now in the United States? Do you think it's big pharmaceutical companies? Do you think it's the CIA? Do you think it's the Mexican government? All of the above? Who do you think?
The controlled mainstream media that doesn't cover it in a search for truth, that doesn't tell the American people. We can't fix it. We, the American people, we can fix anything if we're told what's wrong. But when you have a mainstream media that does not tell us, that it becomes like a spokespeople or a microphone for government interests, and they do it because they trade access. When I say access, if you don't toe the CIA, I had on my show, the expert witness in New York, Ralph McGehee. He was a 25-year CIA agent who, at one point, he was a CIA officer in Vietnam, and he was so dismayed and disheartened by what this agency was doing that he contemplated suicide. Well, Ralph outed an in-house memo on my show, and you can probably find it on the archives. And the memo was from the Public Affairs Office of Central Intelligence, in-house, kind of crowing about how effective they are in hiding the truth. And what the memo said is we, the PIO office, have been extremely successful using our media and Hollywood connections to convert intelligence failures, meaning things like supporting drug dealers, etc., every kind of travesty that you can think of, into successes. Crowing about their ability to fool the American people, to hide the truth. And they could only do it because they're the Public Affairs Office dealing with mainstream media. They control media. What do? When you deal with the Public Affairs Office of Central Intelligence, if you have the reputation of someone who's going to write anything damaging to Central Intelligence, you won't get access. You can't say in your reportage, you can't say my assets or my sources, because they won't give you any sources. You want sources? Well, then you have to say what the sources tell you. Access is a very big deal. Anybody who's got a career in mainstream media, investigative reporting, will agree with me, and they have on the air in my show. So what's the biggest enemy we have is mainstream media that refuses to tell the people.
Propaganda.
And it's a terrible shame, but I've experienced it throughout my career. I'm still you talk about, again, Chapo. Chapo is a big false flag that's convincing everybody watching this and listening to this, wow, we're really at war with the drug dealers. Just not true. Not true, folks. You're saluting a false flag. You're watching BS on television, and it sells you on. All I can say is mainstream media shills for the war on drugs. It's on academia.edu. Read it.
Also, with El Chapo, the Sinaloa cartel is doing business as usual. His sons are running it. Nothing's changed. Nothing. So, just like you said, all this attention is put on him, but big deal.
Many years ago, I was invited by the French government to speak at a conference of an organization that was sponsored by them called the Geopolitical Drug Watch. And they had experts who observed the war on drugs from around the world there to speak. And one of them who took the stage was named Michel Chossudovsky. He was a professor of economics at the University of Ottawa and also an advisor to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. This is a top international financial brain. And he said the following. He said that if America stopped buying drugs tomorrow, it could cause an international banking crisis. Now that's the real truth. He and I became friends because I just loved that this man came forward and told the truth. And so if you want to know what we really want to do, it's not stop drugs. It's not really hurt the drug trafficking business. Years ago, I had written a book that was recommended by the Clinton administration for communities with drug problems, and it was called, I titled the book, Fight Back, How to Take Your Own Neighborhood Back from the Drug Traffickers. And the focus of the book was on focusing ear campaign against drug buyers. And I gave specifics on how to do this. If you prevent drug buyers from coming into your neighborhood, you put the fear of God into them, then drug traffickers won't, there's no business. It's over. And it proved incredibly successful. So successful, at the time I was the head, it's another book you can get of mine. I think it's available. It's called Fight Back by Michael Levine. And what happened was incredible to me and very depressing to me. I needed the assistance. I was hired by the sheriff of Barnstable County, Cape Cod, to bring that program out there. And believe it or not, where it's really needed. And the program became very successful on its own. The citizens took up arms. They got video they armed themselves with video cameras. They created an environment that scared drug buyers away, and the drug business shut down. Well, the first thing that happened is an ex-colleague of mine from the Drug Enforcement Administration Task Force called me and said, Mike, you have to get your people off the streets of this particular town, Mashpee. Why? He said, why? Because we've got cases going, and basically they've all shut down. But they have cases going. You understand? They have investigations that were going to end in arrests, more arrests of drug traffickers who would just be replaced. But the citizens had managed to shut down the business. And it became a crisis of, are we going to do this? Are we going to listen to them or not? It became a political crisis. I was not there to be a politician. I was there to do the job that I know better than most, and that is to stop drug trafficking. The next thing that happened is I sought the help of the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. And they would not support the Fight Back program. And I managed, you're dealing with, I'm a well-trained intelligence agent. I was able to get an in-house memo that they wrote saying that if the Fight Back program is a success, it will take the wind out of the sails of the Partnership for a Drug-Free America on the Cape. So what are the priorities here? The priority was Partnership for a Drug-Free America didn't want to go out of business. Even though it's a program that showed itself to work, they didn't want to get behind it because it would put them out of business. Well, what's the problem here? Well, you call yourself the Partnership for a Drug-Free America. Do you want to make at least Cape Cod drug-free? No, is the answer. Our self-interest is much more important than stopping drugs. And then I thought of this old, I don't know who said this, but it's so true. Once you create a bureaucracy, the first enemy of the people, the first enemy of that bureaucracy, the urge, the will is for the bureaucracy itself to live, to expand, to survive, making the people who created the bureaucracy its first enemy because they had to be controlled to save the bureaucracy. And that's where we are. You want to know who the enemy is? That's the enemy. A mainstream media that won't report, bureaucracies that don't want to go out of business, police agencies that want budgets, big budgets, and it could all be solved. But it never will be. Never will be. Not in my lifetime.
I have a feeling not in mine either because of all the money. Unfortunately, Mike, we are out of time, so let me combine two things as quick as possible. One, if you were to say something to somebody who's considering joining the DEA, considering what you've learned throughout it, what would you say? And the second thing, all the different books we talked about, as well as your old radio show, if you could tell people one more time where they could find those books to read them, and also where they could hear your old shows, and I will also rebroadcast them as well, that'd be great.
Okay. What would I tell a DEA? I have a son who's Homeland Security, loves working narcotic cases. I think my son believes what I said, and that is, so go after these big criminals. If you're using the drug law, whatever you're using, go after people who kill. So I got great satisfaction out of taking a lot of killers off the street, like Papo Mejia. Was it drug wars? Whatever the law is, get them off the street. Make America safer. And I did. I'm proud of the amount of people, the amount of killers, professional murderers that I took off the street. If you really want to do that, go for it, because the Drug Enforcement Administration is an incredibly, well, I don't know, it's not the same anymore. So I really don't know. You'd have to make a lot of inquiries as to how it is now. If you want to know how it was, just read my books and you'll see that it's exciting as hell. It's a high adrenaline, 24/7 pressure cooker of a job with tremendous payment in experience, rewarded feeling. Again, if you can get a feeling of reward by taking killers off the street, go for it.
As far as the books, Big White Lie.
Go to Michael Levine Books. One word, michaellevinebooks.com.
And is also, can people hear your old radio shows there as well?
No, that's expertwitnessradio.org. One word, expertwitnessradio.org. One word.
Thank you again so much, Mike Levine. I'm sorry, I don't want to say that wrong. I know I've had another guest on with the same last name, Levine. Everybody, we will have him back on. Of course, this 1 hour was just literally the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more to this gentleman's story that when he's back, and I hope you all have a chance to do read some of these books, especially what I'm interested in, from the Big White Lie to the mainstream media, the drug war shills, and of course Deep Cover. All these things would give us insight into what is happening, and of course he was able to confirm a couple major things. One, that the CIA is actively protecting these drug traffickers, and two, we finally have a good inkling of who killed the cocaine godmother. Everybody stay tuned. Right after break, we'll be back back with the NSA whistleblower.
On the road again.